In the unforgiving wilderness of Montana Territory, 1847, where men's souls were tested by nature's cruelest trials, a chance encounter between a dying trapper and an abandoned wolf pup would forge a bond that defied every law of the wild. This is not just a story of survival, it's the extraordinary true account of how Samuel Bear Morrison, a man who had lost everything to the frontier's merciless grip, found his humanity again through the most unlikely companion. What began as an act of desperate compassion in the shadow of death would grow into a partnership that would become legend among trappers, traders, and native tribes across the Rocky Mountains. Their story challenges everything we think we know about the line between civilization and wilderness, between enemy and friend, between man and beast. Samuel Morrison had been walking through death's shadow for 3 days when he first heard the crying. The sound cut through the Montana wilderness like a blade through silk, high and desperate, echoing off the towering pines that surrounded him. His fever-addled mind almost dismissed it as another hallucination, like the dancing lights he'd been seeing at the edges of his vision or the phantom voices of his dead wife calling his name through the mountain mist. The infected bear claw wounds across his chest had turned angry and red, seeping through the crude bandages he'd fashioned from his torn shirt. Each step sent fire racing through his ribs, and he knew with the grim certainty that comes to men who've lived long on the frontier that he was dying. The closest settlement was 40 miles south through treacherous mountain passes, and he'd lost his horse to a rockslide 2 days back. His water was nearly gone, his ammunition spent on the grizzly that had nearly claimed his life. But that crying wouldn't stop. Samuel had been trapping these mountains for 15 years, ever since Sarah's death from consumption had left him with nothing but grief and a burning need to disappear into the wilderness. He knew every sound the forest made, from the whistle of wind through granite peaks to the warning chatter of squirrels when predators prowled nearby. This was different. This was something in pain, something young and afraid. Against every instinct that screamed at him to conserve his failing strength, Samuel followed the sound. His boots, worn thin from years of mountain travel, slipped on the loose shale as he climbed toward a rocky outcropping where the cry seemed to originate. His breathing came in ragged gasps, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. More than once he had to stop and lean against a tree, waiting for the world to stop spinning. The crying grew louder as he approached, more desperate, and Samuel realized with growing alarm that it was coming from below the outcropping. Crawling to the edge on hands and knees, fighting waves of nausea from his fever, he peered down into a narrow ravine carved by spring snowmelt. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. 15 feet below, trapped on a ledge barely wide enough for its small body, was a wolf pup. It couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, its fur still bearing the downy softness of youth. The little creature was covered in mud and blood, one of its front legs hanging at an unnatural angle. Around the ledge, scattered like broken dolls, lay the bodies of its packmates and mother, victims of what looked like a rockslide that had torn away part of the ravine wall. The pup looked up at Samuel with eyes that held an intelligence far beyond its weeks, eyes that spoke of pain and terror but also of a desperate, stubborn will to live. In those amber depths, Samuel saw something he recognized, something that reached through his fever and exhaustion to touch a part of his soul he'd thought dead and buried with Sarah. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away. Samuel had seen enough death in his years on the frontier to know that nature was neither kind nor sentimental. The strong survived, the weak perished, and a man foolish enough to risk his own life for a wild animal usually paid the price. Even if he could somehow rescue the pup, what then? He was dying himself, barely able to stay on his feet. He had no food to spare, no way to care for an injured animal, no realistic hope of reaching safety. But, as he stared down at the small creature, memories flooded through his fevered mind. Sarah, laughing as she fed scraps to a stray dog that had followed them home one winter evening in Independence. Sarah, weeping over the tiny grave of the child they'd lost before it had even drawn breath. Sarah, making him promise on her deathbed that he wouldn't let bitterness consume what goodness remained in his heart. The pup's cries had weakened to pitiful whimpers, and Samuel could see that the little creature was failing fast. Blood matted its fur where sharp rocks had cut it, and its breathing was shallow and rapid. If he was going to act, it had to be now. Moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew one mistake would kill them both, Samuel began to descend into the ravine. He had 50 feet of rope in his pack, meant for setting snares but now pressed into service for a far more desperate purpose. The rope was old and frayed in places, but it was all he had. He secured one end around a sturdy pine at the rim and began to lower himself down, his infected wounds screaming in protest with every movement. The descent nearly finished him. Halfway down, his vision went completely black and he hung there, swaying in space, certain he was about to fall to his death. Only the pup's renewed crying, triggered by his approach, kept him conscious enough to continue. When his boots finally touched the narrow ledge, he was shaking so badly he could barely stand. The pup tried to crawl away from him, dragging its broken leg and whimpering in pain. Samuel moved slowly, speaking in the same low, gentle tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses. Up close, he could see that the animal was a male, silver-gray with distinctive black markings around his eyes that gave him an almost mask-like appearance. Despite his injuries and obvious terror, there was something regal about the little creature, a dignity that spoke of noble bloodlines. Samuel had brought nothing with him but his rope and his knife, having left his pack at the top of the ravine. He shrugged out of his coat, ignoring the fresh wave of pain from his chest, and carefully wrapped the pup in the heavy wool. The animal fought weakly at first, but exhaustion and pain soon overcame fear, and he settled into the makeshift carrier with a soft whine. The climb back up was a nightmare that Samuel would remember in vivid detail for the rest of his life. With one arm cradled around the injured pup and one hand gripping the rope, he had to haul himself up 15 feet of sheer rock face using mostly his legs and whatever handholds he could find. 3 times he nearly fell, saved only by desperate lunges that sent fresh agony through his infected wounds. Blood soaked through his shirt and ran down his arms, making his grip slippery and uncertain. When he finally collapsed on solid ground at the top of the ravine, both man and pup were near death. Samuel's fever had spiked dangerously high, and the wolf pup lay motionless in his coat, breathing so shallowly that Samuel wasn't sure the little creature was still alive. They lay there together as the sun began to set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed to mock their desperate situation. As consciousness faded in and out, Samuel found himself talking to the pup, sharing memories of Sarah and stories of his years in the mountains. He talked about the winter he'd been snowed in for 4 months with nothing but jerky and beans, about the time he'd faced down a mountain lion with nothing but his bare hands, about the morning he'd woken to find Sarah cold and still beside him in their little cabin back in Missouri. The pup's breathing gradually steadied, and when Samuel checked his injuries by the fading light, he found that the broken leg was clean break, not compound. With strips torn from his remaining shirt, he fashioned a crude splint using a piece of straight pine branch. The pup whimpered during the procedure but didn't try to bite, seeming to understand that Samuel was trying to help. As full darkness fell and the temperature began to drop, Samuel made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He was going to fight. Not just for his own life, but for the small creature that fate had placed in his path. Sarah had always said that God worked in mysterious ways, and maybe this was her way of telling him that his time on earth wasn't finished yet. Using what little strength remained to him, Samuel built a small fire from dead pine needles and dry branches. He rationed his last few drops of water between himself and the pup, and settled in for what he knew would be either his final night on Earth or the first night of something entirely new. The pup, warm now in the firelight, opened his amber eyes and looked directly at Samuel with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between species. They were both survivors, both wounded, both facing death together in the vast indifference of the wilderness. Whatever happened next, they would face it as partners. Samuel named him Shadow, for the way the pup seemed to emerge from darkness itself, and for how he'd appeared at the shadow of Samuel's own death. As the fire burned low and the mountain night pressed close around them, Samuel Morrison closed his eyes and dreamed of amber eyes and second chances, while beside him, a small wolf pup dreamed of strong hands that had pulled him from the jaws of certain death. Samuel woke to the sound of Shadow's urgent whining and found himself staring into the pale amber eyes of his unlikely companion. The pup had somehow dragged himself closer during the night, his small body pressed against Samuel's side for warmth. The fire had died to cold ashes, and frost covered everything with a crystalline coating that spoke of how close they'd both come to freezing. But they were alive, and, in the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, that was victory enough. The fever had broken sometime in the dark hours before dawn, leaving Samuel weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. His wounds still throbbed with infection, but the angry red streaks that had been racing up his chest had faded. Shadow's breathing was stronger too, though the little wolf still favored his injured leg and moved with the careful deliberation of a creature in pain. They needed water, food, and shelter, in that order. Samuel knew these mountains well enough to remember a natural spring about 2 miles east, fed by snowmelt and reliable even in the driest summers. It would mean leaving the relative safety of their camp, but staying put meant certain death from exposure and starvation. Samuel fashioned a crude carrier for Shadow from his remaining rope and the tatters of his shirt, creating a sling that would allow him to carry the pup while keeping his hands free for climbing over the treacherous terrain ahead. Shadow submitted to being handled with surprising grace, though he watched Samuel's every movement with those intelligent eyes, as if memorizing the face of the man who'd saved his life. The journey to the spring became an odyssey of endurance that tested both their limits. Samuel's infected wounds reopened twice, forcing him to stop and rewrap them with strips torn from his pants. Shadow, despite his broken leg, proved to have remarkable stamina for such a young creature, walking when he could and riding in his makeshift carrier without complaint when the terrain became too rough. They reached the spring as the sun climbed toward its zenith, both exhausted but triumphant. The water was clear and cold, tasting of minerals and snow, and Samuel had never appreciated anything more in his life. He drank deeply, then cupped water in his palms for Shadow, who lapped at it eagerly with his small pink tongue. With water secured, Samuel turned his attention to food. His trapping skills, honed over 15 years in the wilderness, came back to him despite his weakness. Using his knife and some of his remaining rope, he constructed simple snares and set them along the game trails that converged near the spring. Then, he and Shadow settled in to wait, taking shelter under an overhang of rock that would protect them from the mountain weather. It was during these long hours of waiting that the real bond between them began to form. Samuel found himself talking to Shadow as if the pup could understand every word, and Shadow's responses, a complex vocabulary of whines, yips, and body language, seemed almost conversational. When Samuel winced from his wounds, Shadow would press closer, his warm body providing comfort. When strange sounds echoed through the forest, Shadow's ears would perk up and he'd look to Samuel with complete trust, as if confident that his human companion could handle any threat. Their first shared meal came that evening when Samuel's snares yielded 2 fat rabbits. He cooked the meat over a small, smokeless fire, feeding Shadow small pieces by hand while the pup's tail wagged with enthusiasm. The sight of that tiny tail, beating against the ground with pure joy over a simple piece of cooked meat, moved Samuel in ways he hadn't expected. Sarah had always said he was too hard, too closed off from simple pleasures, but Shadow's uncomplicated happiness was infectious. Over the following days, their routine developed naturally. Samuel would check his snares at dawn while Shadow rested, then they'd spend the morning traveling toward lower elevations where the weather was less harsh and game more plentiful. Afternoons were for hunting and fishing, skills that Samuel taught Shadow through patient demonstration. The young wolf proved to be a quick learner, his natural instincts sharpened by Samuel's wilderness knowledge. Shadow's leg healed with surprising speed, helped by his youth and the careful attention Samuel paid to keeping the splint clean and properly aligned. Within a week, the pup was putting weight on it again, and, within 2, he was running short distances with only a slight limp to show for his ordeal. But it was their shared experiences that truly cemented their partnership. The night a mountain lion stalked their camp, drawn by the smell of their cooking fire, Shadow proved that his wolf heritage ran deep. Despite his size and youth, he positioned himself between Samuel and the approaching predator, his lips pulled back to reveal sharp white teeth while a growl rumbled from his chest that seemed impossibly deep for such a small animal. Samuel, rifle in hand, was prepared to fight, but the sight of the determined pup facing down a predator 3 times his size with absolute fearlessness moved him profoundly. The lion, perhaps more puzzled than threatened by the strange pair, eventually wandered off to find easier prey. But that night established a pattern that would define their relationship for years to come. They were partners, each contributing their strengths to their mutual survival, each willing to risk everything for the other. As they descended from the high peaks toward more habitable country, other travelers began to take notice of the unusual pair. At a trading post near Fort Benton, a grizzled mountain man named Jake Reeves watched in amazement as Shadow, now grown to the size of a medium dog but retaining his wolf features, followed Samuel's hand signals with military precision. Never seen anything like it, Jake told the other trappers gathered around the post's bar. "That wolf's trained better than most dogs I've seen, but there's something wild about him still. Saw him catch a rabbit yesterday, moved like liquid lightning. But then, he brought it straight back to Morrison like he was fetching a stick." Word of Samuel and Shadow began to spread throughout the territory. Native American tribes, many of whom revered wolves as spiritual guides, spoke of the trapper who'd been blessed by the wolf spirits. Some traders claimed Samuel had medicine powers, that his wolf companion could smell weather changes days in advance and lead them away from dangerous country. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Samuel and Shadow had developed a communication that transcended normal human-animal relationships. Shadow could indeed sense weather changes with his superior hearing and smell, but, more than that, he'd learned to read Samuel's moods and intentions with uncanny accuracy. When Samuel was troubled, Shadow would press close and remain quiet. When Samuel was relaxed and happy, Shadow would play and explore with puppy-like enthusiasm. For Samuel, Shadow represented something he'd thought lost forever after Sarah's death, the ability to care for another living being without reservation. The wolf never judged his dark moods or his long silences. Shadow simply accepted Samuel exactly as he was while offering his own fierce loyalty in return. Their first winter together tested that bond in ways neither could have anticipated. They'd built a small cabin in a hidden valley south of the Missouri River, a place Samuel had discovered years earlier but never had reason to use. The cabin was basic but solid, with a stone fireplace and enough space for both man and wolf to wait out the harsh Montana winter. Shadow had grown considerably by then, his wolf nature asserting itself in ways that would have concerned most men. He stood nearly 3 feet at the shoulder, his silver coat thick and luxurious, his amber eyes holding the intelligent wildness that marked him as something far beyond a domestic animal. But, with Samuel, he remained gentle and obedient, sleeping by the fire each night and greeting each morning with enthusiasm for whatever adventures the day might bring. It was during a blizzard in late January that Shadow truly proved his worth as a partner. Samuel had come down with pneumonia, his strength sapped by the lung infection that killed more mountain men than bears or bullets ever had. For 3 days, he lay in his bunk, barely conscious, while the storm raged outside their cabin. Shadow took over completely. The wolf kept the fire going by dragging logs from their woodpile, somehow understanding that the flames meant warmth and life for his stricken companion. He brought Samuel snow to melt for water, pressed his warm body against the fevered man during the worst of the chills, and even managed to catch and kill a rabbit that he brought to the cabin and left by Samuel's bedside. When Samuel finally recovered, weak but alive, he found Shadow thin from sharing his own meager food supplies and exhausted from days of constant vigilance. The wolf had risked his own survival to care for the man who'd saved him, completing a circle of loyalty that would define the rest of their lives together. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Samuel's reputation as the man with the wolf had spread far enough to reach the ears of wealthy Eastern hunters who were willing to pay premium prices for guides who could show them the real wilderness. Shadow, now fully grown and magnificent to behold, became as much an attraction as Samuel's legendary tracking skills. But those who thought they were hiring a novelty act quickly learned otherwise. Shadow was a working partner, not a pet. He could track wounded game through terrain that would challenge the best hunting dogs, warn of approaching weather that could trap travelers in deadly conditions, and move through hostile territory with a silence that saved lives on more than one occasion. The money was good, better than Samuel had ever made from trapping alone, but, more importantly, the work gave him and Shadow purpose beyond mere survival. They were becoming legendary figures in the territory, their story growing with each telling around campfires and in trading posts throughout the Rocky Mountains. Yet despite their fame, Samuel never forgot that Shadow was, at heart, a wild creature who'd chosen to share his life with a human. Every morning, he half expected to find the wolf gone, returned to the wilderness that had birthed him. And every morning, he was quietly grateful to find Amber Eyes watching him with affection and anticipation for the day ahead. Their bond had grown from desperate necessity into something rarer and more precious, true partnership built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and an understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between species. They were no longer just man and wolf, but something new under the Montana sky, proof that the wilderness could forge connections stronger than blood and deeper than instinct. The test of their bond came 5 years after that first desperate meeting in the ravine, when Shadow was in his prime and Samuel had earned a reputation as one of the finest guides in the Montana Territory. It arrived in the form of Colonel Harrison Blackwood, a railroad surveyor from Chicago who'd been hired to map potential routes through the Rockies for the expanding Transcontinental Railroad. Blackwood was everything Samuel despised about Eastern businessmen: arrogant, impatient, and convinced that money could solve any problem the wilderness might present. He'd come west with a small army of assistants, guards, and enough supplies for a military campaign, all to accomplish what Samuel could do with Shadow and a good pack horse. But the money Blackwood offered was extraordinary, enough to set Samuel up for life if he chose to retire from guiding. More importantly, the railroad survey would take them through the heart of Blackfoot territory, where tensions between native tribes and white settlers had reached a deadly breaking point. Blackwood's previous guide had quit after 2 weeks, claiming the job was suicide. Samuel might have refused if not for Shadow's reaction to the colonel. The wolf, normally wary of strangers, seemed actively hostile toward Blackwood, his hackles rising whenever the man approached. Samuel had learned to trust Shadow's instincts about people completely, but the money was too good to pass up, and he convinced himself that Shadow was simply reacting to the man's obvious fear of him. They set out in late spring with Blackwood's expedition, 12 men total including Samuel and Shadow. The group was well armed and provisioned, but Samuel quickly realized that their size and noise made them a target rather than a deterrent. They moved through the wilderness like a traveling circus, leaving a trail that any competent tracker could follow for miles. Shadow adapted to the group with professional tolerance, but Samuel could see the strain in his partner's behavior. The wolf was used to the quiet communion of their solitary travels, the subtle communications and shared decision-making that had kept them alive through countless dangers. Now he was forced to follow a loud, stumbling group that ignored every rule of wilderness survival. The first sign of real trouble came 3 weeks into the survey, when they reached a narrow canyon that Blackwood insisted they traverse despite Samuel's warnings about potential ambush sites. Shadow had been increasingly agitated all morning, his ears constantly swiveling and his nose working overtime to process scents that spoke of danger. Samuel pulled the colonel aside and tried to explain his concerns, but Blackwood dismissed them with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real danger. "Morrison, I'm paying you to guide us, not to turn us into cowards at the first sign of difficulty. We have schedules to keep and investors to satisfy." That afternoon, as they entered the canyon, Shadow suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His entire body went rigid, and he turned to look at Samuel with eyes that held an urgent warning. Samuel had seen that expression before, usually moments before they encountered bears, mountain lions, or other deadly threats. This time, the threat was human. The Blackfoot warriors struck without warning, appearing from concealed positions among the rocks like ghosts materialized from stone. The first volley of arrows dropped 3 of Blackwood's men before they could even draw their weapons. The survivors scrambled for cover behind boulders and fallen logs while war cries echoed off the canyon walls. In the chaos of that first attack, Shadow disappeared. One moment he was at Samuel's side, the next he was gone, vanished into the maze of rocks and shadows that filled the canyon floor. Samuel felt a momentary panic, wondering if his partner had finally abandoned him for the safety of the wilderness, but he was too busy fighting for his life to dwell on the thought. The battle raged for hours, with Blackwood's remaining men slowly being whittled down by invisible enemies who knew every hiding place in the canyon. Samuel's frontier experience kept him alive when trained soldiers fell around him, but even his skills had limits against such overwhelming odds. As the sun began to set and ammunition ran low, Samuel realized they were all going to die in this godforsaken canyon. Blackwood, cowering behind a wagon wheel with tears streaming down his face, kept babbling about surrender, but Samuel knew the Blackfoot well enough to understand that surrender was not an option. They'd violated sacred hunting grounds, and blood was the only currency that would satisfy the debt. That's when Shadow returned. The wolf came from behind the Blackfoot positions like an avenging spirit, moving through the rocks with the silent grace that was his birthright. But he wasn't attacking the warriors directly. Instead, he was creating chaos, confusion, and fear among horses that had never encountered a predator like him. The Blackfoot war horses, trained for battle against human enemies, panicked completely at Shadow's scent and presence. They reared and bolted, carrying warriors away from their positions and disrupting carefully laid ambush plans. In the confusion, Samuel saw his chance. "Follow me," he shouted to the survivors, and led them in a desperate charge toward the canyon's narrow exit. Shadow appeared at his side as if summoned by thought alone, and together they carved a path through the chaos of startled horses and disoriented warriors. They almost made it. The last warrior, a young brave painted for war, stepped directly into their path with a tomahawk raised and death in his eyes. Samuel's rifle was empty, his pistol lost somewhere in the rocks, and there was no time to reload. The tomahawk began its deadly arc toward Samuel's skull. Shadow hit the warrior like a silver thunderbolt, 60 pounds of muscle and fang driving the man backward into the rocks. They fought with primal fury, wolf and human, each fighting for the life of what they held most dear. Samuel heard the sickening sound of snapping bone, a human scream cut short, and then Shadow was beside him again, blood on his muzzle but his amber eyes still bright with life. They ran then, the 5 survivors of Blackwood's expedition, with Blackfoot war cries echoing behind them and certain death waiting if they slowed even for a moment. Samuel led them through hidden paths that only he and Shadow knew, across streams that would mask their scent, through terrain so difficult that only desperate men would attempt it. They traveled for 3 days without stopping, living on stream water and what little jerky Samuel had in his pack. Blackwood, his arrogance completely broken by terror, followed Samuel's orders without question, finally, understanding the true nature of the wilderness he'd thought to conquer with money and firepower. When they finally reached Fort Benton, Samuel was greeted as a hero. Word of their escape had somehow preceded them, growing in the telling until he and Shadow were credited with single-handedly fighting off 100 warriors. The territorial governor offered him a medal and a permanent position as chief scout for the army. Samuel declined both. The experience in the canyon had crystallized something that had been growing in his mind for years. The West was changing, filling up with people like Blackwood who saw the wilderness as something to be conquered rather than respected. The railroad would come, bringing with it cities and farms and all the complications of civilization. But there were still places where a man and his wolf could live free, where the old ways still held power, where the bond forged in a rocky ravine could continue to grow and deepen. Samuel had heard stories of Alaska, a territory so vast and wild that it would take generations to tame, if it ever could be tamed at all. That autumn, as the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Samuel and Shadow set out for the North Country. They traveled light, carrying only what they needed for survival, leaving behind the fame and comfort they could have claimed in Montana. The journey to Alaska became their greatest adventure yet. They spent 2 years traveling through Canada, living off the land and learning from the Inuit and other northern peoples who understood the special relationship between humans and wolves. Shadow, now fully mature and magnificent, was welcomed by these cultures as a spirit guide, and Samuel found acceptance among people who valued wisdom over wealth. In the vast wilderness of Alaska, they finally found what they'd been seeking without even knowing they were looking for it, a place where their partnership could exist without explanation or justification, where the bond between man and wolf was seen as natural and powerful rather than strange or threatening. They built a cabin on the shores of a pristine lake surrounded by mountains that had never felt the tread of white men's boots. There, Samuel taught survival skills to prospectors and hunters who ventured into the territory, while Shadow raised a family with a wild she-wolf who accepted Samuel as part of her pack. Samuel Morrison died peacefully in his sleep on a winter morning 20 years later, with Shadow's great-grandson keeping watch by his bedside. He was buried on a hill overlooking the lake, with a simple marker that read, "Samuel Morrison, he lived free." Shadow had passed on 5 years earlier, at the remarkable age of 18, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his bloodline into the wild. But their story lived on, passed down through generations of trappers, hunters, and native peoples who understood that some bonds transcend the ordinary boundaries of life. Travelers in Alaska still speak of seeing a silver wolf leading lost souls to safety, or of finding help in desperate situations from a ghostly figure accompanied by amber eyes that glow in the darkness. Whether these stories are true or merely legend doesn't matter to those who understand the real meaning of Samuel and Shadow's tale. It's the story of what happens when two souls, damaged by loss and hardship, find healing in each other's companionship. It speaks to the possibility of partnership across all the divisions that normally separate us, whether those divisions are species, culture, or simply the walls we build around our own hearts. In a world increasingly dominated by progress and civilization, their story reminds us that some of life's greatest treasures are found not in what we build or acquire, but in the bonds we form with those brave enough to walk beside us through the wilderness of existence. The wolves still sing in the Alaska mountains, their voices carrying across the vast spaces between earth and sky. And, sometimes, on clear winter nights when the aurora dances overhead, those who listen carefully can hear an answering call that sounds almost human, as if somewhere in the eternal wilderness, the bond between a dying trapper and an orphaned pup continues to grow stronger with each passing season. Samuel Morrison and Shadow prove that love transcends species, that loyalty can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most profound relationships are forged not in comfort and safety, but in the crucible of shared survival against impossible odds. Their story stands as testament to the unbreakable bonds that can form between any two beings willing to risk everything for each other, in a world where such bonds are rarer and more precious than gold.